Dust rose from the cracked earth under a relentless Montana sun. A stagecoach thundered into the dusty street of a forgotten town. Wheels grinding, horses lathered and wild-eyed. 4 women stepped down into the harsh light. 4 men waited on the platform, hats in hand, mouths slightly open. The numbers did not match. 3 letters had gone out. 3 were expected. The last woman's gaze locked with the tallest man. Exhaustion and something unyielding lived behind her eyes. Behind them, the wind already carried the first whispers. Farther east, a man in a fine suit was already packing for the long ride west. Something was coming that would not stop at the edge of the ranch. Silver Fork, Montana Territory, 1885. The wind came down off the ridge that morning carrying dust and nothing else. No rain in 6 weeks. No relief in sight. Just the kind of dry that cracked leather boots and turned a man's hands to sandpaper. Wade Colton stood at the corral fence and watched the sun climb over land that wasn't paying its bills. 4,000 acres, 200 head of cattle, give or take. 1 roof that leaked in 3 places, and a barn that groaned every time the wind picked up past 10 miles an hour, and 4 brothers left to run it. Because their father was gone. Because their mother had followed him 2 winters later, like she couldn't stand the quiet without him. Which left Wade holding a rope with nothing tied to the other end except responsibility. He was 30 years old, and he already had the shoulders of a man twice that. "You're doing the face again," Silas said, coming up beside him with a coffee cup he hadn't earned yet. 25 and grinning like the world owed him a favor. The one where you stare at the fence like it insulted your mother. "Somebody's got to look at the fence, Silas. Somebody's got to fix the fence. That's you. Tomorrow. I have plans tomorrow. You have plans every day. None of them involve a hammer." Silas laughed. Easy, loose. The kind of laugh that got him out of chores and into trouble in roughly equal measure. He had their mother's eyes and their father's mouth, and he used both of them like weapons, mostly on women who should have known better. Except lately even Silas had gone quiet some nights. Because a man can only laugh so long at an empty house before the joke stops landing. That was the truth none of them said out loud. So Wade said it a different way. "We need help," he said. "Real help. Not seasonal hands who leave the second the first snow hits. We need wives," Emmett said. He'd come up from the porch without either of them hearing him, which was Emmett's whole way of moving through the world. Quiet. Deliberate. A book always somewhere near his hand, even when his hands were busy with something else. Silas nearly choked on his coffee. "Say that again. You heard me. I heard the words. I didn't believe them coming out of your mouth." Emmett shrugged. Not embarrassed. Just certain. There's a paper I'm out of Chicago. The Matrimonial Times. Women looking for a fresh start out west. Men looking for the same. You place an advertisement. You write letters. If it suits both parties. It's a business transaction, Wade said. It's practical, Emmett corrected. Which is what this ranch needs more of. Silas looked between them like he was watching a joke, turned serious in real time and couldn't decide if he liked it. "You're both out of your minds." "Maybe," Wade said. "Or maybe you're 25 and you think the right woman's going to ride up out of nowhere because you smiled at her once in town." That landed. Silas's jaw worked like he wanted to argue and couldn't find the ground to stand on. Because the truth was, there weren't enough women in Silver Fork to go around. Because the ones who came through were passing through to somewhere better. Because a rancher with dirt under his nails and debt on his books wasn't exactly a prize in anybody's eyes but his own family's. So the choice sat there in the dust between them, ugly and practical at the same time. Toby came around the barn just then, 20 years old and moving like a colt that hadn't grown into its own legs yet. He'd heard the tail end of it. "Wives," he said, like he was tasting the word, testing it. "Real ones. From a catalog." "It's not catalog, Toby." "It's a little bit of catalog," Silas muttered. Toby's whole face had gone soft and hopeful in a way that tugged at something behind Wade's ribs. Because Toby was the one who still believed things could just be good, simple, kind. He hadn't had it beaten out of him yet, the way the rest of them had, one hard winter at a time. "I want his hooskin," Toby said. Quiet. Certain, in his own boyish way, that's all. Doesn't have to be anything else. Just kind. Nobody laughed at that, not even Silas. Wade looked at his 3 brothers standing there in the thin morning light, and something in him gave way. Not all at once. Just enough. "Fine," he said. "Write your letters." They wrote them that same week, sitting around the kitchen table with 1 lamp and 4 different kinds of nerve. Silas wrote his in 20 minutes, laughing the whole time, describing himself as better looking than he had any right to. He asked for a woman with a lively wit, because Lord knew this ranch could use somebody who talked back to him the way he deserved. Emmett labored over his for 3 nights, crossed out more than he kept. In the end, he asked for someone who loved poetry, pressed flowers, someone who might understand that a man could work a ranch with his hands and still keep something soft folded up inside him where nobody could see it. Toby's letter was 4 sentences long, and every one of them was true. He wanted someone kind. He said, please. He signed his full name like it mattered, because to him it did. And Wade sat with a blank page in front of him for 2 hours and didn't write a single word. Because what was he supposed to say? That he needed a partner, not a wife. That romance was a luxury the ranch's ledger book didn't have room for. That somewhere under the calluses, there was a man who remembered what it felt like to want something, just because he wanted it. And he'd buried that man a long time ago, because wanting things didn't keep the roof from leaking. He folded the blank paper, put it in the drawer of the desk in the front room, told himself he'd finish it tomorrow. Tomorrow came and went, and so did about 6 weeks of tomorrows, each one busier than the last, until the letter sat forgotten under a stack of feed receipts, and the whole idea felt like something that had happened to somebody else, which was, in its own way, the first mistake of this whole story. Except nobody knew it yet. The letters went out. 3 of them anyway, and the weeks passed the way they do on a ranch, which is to say they didn't pass gently. They got dragged, fences got mended, cattle got moved to better grass before the creek ran dry. Silas flirted his way out of 2 separate poker debts in town, which Wade found out about later and was still angry about. Emmett read by lamplight until his eyes ached. Toby grew another inch. Somehow, though nobody could say where he found the food to fuel it, 2,000 miles east, in a narrow rented room above a Boston milliner's shop, 4 sisters were making a decision that would reach the Colton Ranch long before any of them would. To understand why a woman would gamble her sisters' lives on a stranger's printing error, a person would have needed to see what Boston had become for the Marsh sisters in the 2 years since their mother died. They had not always lived above a milliner's shop. There had been a house once, narrow but respectable, with a brass knocker and a girl who came in twice a week to help with the wash. There had been a workshop out back where their father tested valve castings and drew diagrams late into the night, humming to himself, wits, always humming, a man who loved his work the way some men loved a woman. There had been for a handful of years the particular safety of a family that believed its hardest days were behind it. All of that had gone the way most fortunes go when the wrong man gets a hand on the ledger. Quietly, at first, then all at once. After the conviction, the house was the first thing to go, sold at a loss to cover legal costs that never once bought their father a fair hearing. Then, the workshop tools, piece by piece, to men who paid a fraction of their worth and knew it. Their mother had taken in mending. Then piecework for a milliner on Beacon Street, trimming hats 12 hours a day for wages that wouldn't have covered the coal bill in the old house. Augusta, 17 at the time, had gone to work beside her within the year, because 4 growing girls could not be fed on ribbon trimming alone, and somebody had to learn the trade fast enough to be useful. Their mother had never fully recovered from what came after the prison's letter. Something in her had simply stopped reaching for the future the way it once had. She kept working. She kept smiling for her daughters, most days. But she took to sewing at night by a single candle, long after the girls were meant to be asleep, and Bea, sharing the nearest bed, would sometimes wake to the sound of thread being pulled taut, over and over, in the dark. But she died 4 years after her husband. Quietly, in her sleep, the doctor said, though Augusta had never quite believed a body could simply decide to stop from grief alone and not call it something crueler underneath. That left 4 sisters. No income beyond what the milliner's shop paid, which was not enough. No family close enough to matter, save one aunt on their father's side, a woman named Prudence, who arrived at the funeral in good boots and better opinions, and who made it plain, within the first hour, exactly what she thought ought to happen next. 4 unmarried girls cannot simply keep house together indefinitely. Aunt Prudence had said, over tea neither of them wanted, 3 days after the burial. It isn't proper. It isn't practical. I've made inquiries. There's a respectable situation for Lucy with a family in Hartford in need of a companion for their elderly mother. Constance could go into service. She's sturdy. She'd manage well enough. Beatrice has a talent for needlework. I understand there are positions, and me, Augustus had said, very quietly, very evenly, The same voice she would use years later on a dusty platform in front of 4 strangers. "What arrangement have you made for me, Aunt Prudence?" Her aunt had looked at her for a long moment, taking in Augusta had felt it happen. Felt the assessment land, her build, her age, the plainness of a woman nobody had ever described as delicate. "There's a widower in Providence," her aunt had said. "Not young, but comfortable. He wouldn't be particular." As though to a stranger 3 times, her age was a kindness extended to a woman nobody expected better for. Augusta had sat with that sentence for a long time, after her aunt left that afternoon, turning it over the way she would later turn over a printer's error in a matrimonial newspaper, and had come to a decision that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with survival. They would not be split apart. Not into a companion's chair in Hartford, not into a stranger's kitchen, not into a widower's house in Providence where a 50-year-old man wouldn't be particular. Whatever came next, it would come to all 4 of them, together, woman, or it would not come at all. It was around that same time, though Augusta would not connect the 2 threads until much later, until a stranger in a fine suit rode into Silver Fork asking careful questions that she first noticed someone asking after the family. A man at the milliner's shop, polite, well-dressed, inquiring whether the Marsh girls still lived in the neighborhood, whether their father had left any papers behind, any effects. The shop owner had answered him plainly, having no reason not to, and had mentioned it to Augusta only in passing, the way a person mentions weather. Augusta had felt something cold move through her at the words. She had not known why, not then. She had only known, with the same instinct that had once told her not to trust in advertisements arithmetic, that it was time to leave Boston, before whatever was circling got close enough to see them clearly. So when the Matrimonial Times crossed her path 3 weeks later, listing 4 brothers and a Montana cattle ranch against what was almost certainly a single man's advertisement, she had not seen a mistake to correct. She had seen a door already half open, in a city about to become too dangerous to stay in, and she had walked her sisters through it without looking back. She hadn't told any of them the whole of it, not the man asking questions at the shop, not her aunt's arithmetic of which sister was suited, for which kind of servitude. She had only said, "There's a chance out west." A door, and she'd watched each of their faces while she said it, gauging what they could bear to hear and what they couldn't yet. Connie had wanted proof. Bea had wanted reassurance. Lucy had simply wanted to go, the way she wanted most things, with her whole undefended heart. Augusta had given none of them the full truth, that she'd noticed the arithmetic didn't add up. That 4 names against 1 likely advertisement meant somebody's error, and errors could be walked through like open doors if a person was desperate enough not to look too closely at the latch. She was desperate enough. They all were, and so she sent the letter herself, describing all 4 of them in careful, honest language, and she prayed, genuinely prayed, on her knees, the way she hadn't since her father's arrest, that whatever waited on the other end of that error would be kinder than what they were leaving behind. And then one gray morning in early spring, word down from the stage office in Silver Fork. The brides were arriving. All of them. Same coach, same day. Wade rode into town with his brothers trailing behind him, like he was leading them to their own hanging, which, in a way, Silas kept saying, he sort of was. "You're not funny," Wade told him. "I'm a little funny. You're nervous is what you are." Silas didn't answer that, which told Wade everything he needed to know. They stood on the platform outside the stage office, 4 men trying to look like they weren't sweating through their shirts in the cool morning air. The street around them carried on the way it always did. A wagon creaking past, loaded with grain sacks. 2 old-timers arguing outside the Mercantile about a horse trade gone sideways. The smell of wood smoke and horse and the reddish dust that got into everything in Silver Fork and never quite left, no matter how hard a person swept. "Remember the plan," Wade said. "Low. Be gentlemen. Help with the trunks. Don't say anything foolish before they've had a hot meal in them." "I always know how to treat a lady," Silas said, adjusting his collar for the 3rd time in 2 minutes. "You especially need the reminder." Emmett had his hands clasped behind his back like a man at a funeral. Toby was practically vibrating, because somewhere down that road, 4 women were coming to change their whole lives, and none of the Colton brothers had the first idea how much. The rumble came first, then the dust cloud on the horizon, rising up gold in the morning light, then the coach itself, groaning and swaying, the driver hauling back on the reins until the whole rig shuddered to a stop in front of the office. The driver was an old man named Cyrus Pratt, weathered like driftwood, with a wad of tobacco tucked in one cheek that he spat clean of the platform before he even climbed down. "Got yourselves a delivery, Coltons," he called out. 4 of them. Wade's stomach dropped straight through the boards under his feet. 4, he repeated, because that math didn't work. 3 letters, 3 brides. Wade hadn't sent anything at all. His own letter was still folded under a stack of receipts back home, unfinished and unsent. "That's what the paperwork says," Cyrus said, already moving to unload the trunk strapped to the back of the coach. 4 ticket, paid in full. Colton Ranch. "There's some mistake," Wade started. Except the coach door swung open right then, and the first mistake, if that's even what it was, stepped down into the Montana sunlight. She was young, maybe 20, and she looked at the dusty little street of Silver Fork like it was the most astonishing place she'd ever laid eyes on. Wide-eyed, hopeful, her whole face lit up with something that hadn't yet learned to be afraid of disappointment. She was round-cheeked and soft through the middle, built for warmth rather than for hardship, and she carried herself like nobody had ever once told her to apologize for the space she took up in a room. This was Lucy Marsh, though none of them knew her name yet. Toby's breath caught somewhere in his chest and just stayed there. She turned back to the coach and offered her hand to the next passenger, careful and steady, and out came a second young woman, softer in her movements, graceful in a way that seemed almost private, like she was used to taking up as little space as possible, even though her frame, generous through the hips and shoulders, told a different story than her posture did. She held a leather portfolio against her chest with both arms, the way some women hold babies. This was Beatrice Marsh. Bea, and when her gaze passed over the rough wooden storefronts and the men standing on the platform, something in her face flickered, not fear exactly, more like bracing. Emmett found himself stepping forward before he decided to. He didn't know why. Then the third. She didn't step down so much as she arrived, chin lifted, deep, spine straight, her eyes already moving over the 4 brothers, like she was pricing cattle at auction and not much impressed with what she saw. She was built solid and sturdy, wide through the shoulders, in a way that made her look like she could outwork any man on that platform, and knew it. And she wore that fact the way some women wore jewelry, deliberately and without apology. This was Constance Marsh, Connie, and Silas, who had never in inside of 5 minutes felt his easy grin falter, just slightly, under the weight of her stare. "Well," he muttered, mostly to himself. "That's new." Wade barely heard him, because he was looking at the 4th woman, the one who hadn't come down yet, the one still framed in the shadowed doorway of the coach, like she was gathering something inside herself before she let the town see her. When she finally stepped down, she moved like a woman twice her age. Not slow, just careful, like every motion cost something, and she'd learned not to waste any of them. She was full through the shoulders and the hips, where the fashion plates back east would have turned their noses up at, and she carried it the way a person carries their own name, like there was nothing about it to apologize for, and she'd stopped waiting for permission to feel that way a long time ago. Her eyes found Wade's across the platform, direct, unflinching, and underneath all that steadiness something exhausted, something that had been holding on so long it had forgotten what it felt like to let go. This was Augusta Marsh. Nobody said anything for a moment. The whole street seemed to hold its breath, and somewhere near the Mercantile, a woman Wade didn't recognize leaned close to another and whispered something behind a gloved hand, her eyes moving over the 4 sisters with the unkindness of a stranger who has decided, at a glance, that she already knows everything worth knowing about a person. Lucy's chin lifted just slightly at the sound of it, though she didn't turn to look. Connie did turn and met the woman's stare so squarely that the woman found something urgent to attend to in her own market basket. None of the sisters flinched outright. Wade noticed that, filed it away without understanding yet why it mattered. Cyrus Pratt broke the silence, hauling the last trunk down off the coach with a grunt. "Matched set," he said, not unkindly, "all addressed to the Colton Ranch. Never seen the like." Wade's mind was doing frantic math that refused to add up, because 3 letters went out, because 3 women should have arrived on 3 different days to meet 3 different men. Except here they all stood together, and the resemblance between them was impossible to miss once you looked for it. The same set to the jaw, the same deep auburn catching the morning light in 4 different shades, the same tired, wary strength in how they held themselves, like they'd walked into this town already braced for the door to be slammed in their faces. "Ma'am," Wade said, stepping forward, hat in hand, because it seemed like the thing to do even though nothing about this moment made sense. "There's been some kind of mistake. We were expecting 3 ladies. Separate arrivals, not—" "There's no mistake, Mr. Colton." Augusta's voice was steady low, carrying the calm of someone who has rehearsed a hard thing so many times it no longer shakes when it comes out. "My name is Augusta Marsh," she said. "These are my sisters, Constance, Beatrice, Lucy." She gestured to each in turn, unhurried, like she was daring anyone to interrupt her. "You are Wade, Silas Emmett, and Tobias Colton. Each of you wrote a letter to the Matrimonial Times." "We are the 4 women who answered." A gust of wind kicked dust down the street and rattled the tin sign hanging over the stage office. The Colton brothers stood there with their mouths slightly open. 4 grown men struck dumb on a public street. Toby looked at Lucy. Emmett looked at Bea. Silas looked at Connie, who was still looking at him like he was something she'd scraped off her boot, which left Wade and Augusta staring at each other across 6 feet of dusty platform, both of them holding a piece of the same impossible puzzle. "But I didn't," Wade started, and stopped. Because how did a man explain that his own letter was still sitting at home, blank and folded and forgotten, without sounding like he was calling a woman a liar in front of the whole town? Something moved behind Augusta's eyes, just for a second. A crack in all that careful composure. "The paper made an error," she said. "They printed an advertisement listing 4 brothers at the Colton Ranch, all seeking wives. When we saw it," she stopped herself, started again quieter. "When we saw it, we saw a chance to stay together. And there it was, the thing underneath the thing. Not 4 independent women looking for husbands at all. A family, cast loose from wherever they'd come from, looking for the one thing that mattered more to them than pride, safe harbor." Nobody on that platform said a word for a long moment. Silas recovered first, because Silas always recovered first. That was practically his job in this family. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, low, mostly to himself, his eyes drifting to Connie, despite every ounce of good sense telling him not to look at a woman who was currently looking at him like he owed her money. She caught him staring. Didn't blink. "Something funny, Mr. Colton?" "Not yet," Silas said. "Give it time." She turned away from him like he'd stopped existing, which somehow stung more than an insult would have. Toby leaned toward Wade, his hopeful expression clouding over into something closer to confusion. "What do we do?" Wade didn't answer right away, because he was still looking at Augusta, at the tired, travel-worn set of her shoulders, at the fierce, protective way the 4 of them had arranged themselves, without seeming to think about it, into a small unbroken line, at their luggage, a few trunks, a couple of canvas bags, probably everything they owned in the world, packed into a space that wouldn't fill the back of one wagon. His practical mind was screaming at him. This wasn't the deal. This was messy and complicated and doomed to fail before it started. The ranch could barely feed 4 brothers, let alone 8 mouths total. Except there was another voice underneath the practical one. Quieter, more stubborn. The one that had kept this family together through 2 funerals and 4 bad winters, and it was telling him something different. These women had traveled 2,000 miles on nothing but a hope and a printing error, and here they stood, waiting to find out if that hope had been worth the trip. He drew a slow breath, filled his lungs with dust and decision at the same time. "Cyrus," he said, "help us load these trunks onto the wagon." He turned back to Augusta. Her expression hadn't changed, but something in her posture eased, just slightly, like she'd been braced for a blow that hadn't landed. "The ranch is a 2-hour ride from here," Wade said. "You and your sisters look like you could use a hot meal and a bed that isn't moving under you. You can rest there tonight." He paused, let the words settle, and then he said, "We'll talk." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even close to one. It was a stay of execution, nothing more. But for 4 sisters standing in the harsh Montana sun, with nowhere else in the world to go, it was the first real light seen in longer than any of them wanted to admit. The ride out to the ranch took 2 hours, and it felt like 4. Wade drove the wagon. Augusta sat up front beside him because somebody had to, and none of the others had volunteered fast enough to stop it from being her. The rest piled into the back among the trunks, Silas making conversation that Connie answered in clipped, unimpressed syllables. Emmett quiet, stealing glances at the portfolio Bea still hadn't let go of. Toby and Lucy, somehow, already talking easily, the way people do when neither one of them has learned yet to be careful. Wade and Augusta didn't talk at all, which suited him fine, he told himself. Because what was there to say? Because every question that came to mind sounded either cruel or foolish, once he tried to shape it into words. Because the silence, at least, was honest. Except somewhere around the halfway point, with the mountains rising blue and jagged on the horizon, Augusta spoke without turning her head. You're wondering how a woman convinces three sisters to get on a train for 2,000 miles based on a newspaper misprint. Wade kept his eyes on the road. Something like that. I didn't convince them, she said. I told them the truth. That we had nothing left where we were. That this was a door, even if it was the wrong door. And they trusted me enough to walk through it anyway. That's a lot to put on four women. Trusting a stranger's mistake. It wasn't a stranger's mistake I was trusting, Mr. Colton. Something in her voice made him glance over despite himself. It was my own decision, she said. I read the notice. I knew it was likely an error. I sent the letter anyway. He stared at her. You knew. I suspected a pause. I hoped I was wrong. I wasn't. Wade didn't know whether to be furious or impressed, and the fact that he couldn't decide bothered him more than either feeling alone would have. That's either the boldest thing I've ever heard, he said slowly, or the most reckless. Most days, Augusta said, I've found those two things look identical from a distance. And Lord help him, something in Wade's chest, some old rusted shut door. He'd shut it again. Fast. Told himself it was just fatigue talking. Just the strangeness of the day. Except it didn't feel like fatigue. It felt like recognition. The Colton Ranch was less a homestead and more a monument to stubbornness. The main house sat low and sturdy, log-built and mud-chinked, weathered gray by 20 winters, surrounded by a scatter of barns and sheds that all looked like they'd survived through sheer refusal to fall down. It was a place built for work, not comfort, and the arrival of four sisters threw its entire rhythm into instant chaotic disarray, because 8 people in a house built for 4 meant elbows in unexpected places. Meant Silas nearly upending a bucket of milk, trying to step around Connie in the kitchen doorway. Meant Toby tripping over a rug that had sat in the same spot for a decade, simply because Lucy happened to be standing on the other side of the room. The sisters, for their part, moved through the chaos with a kind of practiced grace that told Wade they'd lived in tight quarters before. Close enough, long enough that 8 people under one roof didn't rattle them the way it clearly rattled his brothers. Augusta took over the kitchen within an hour of arriving, and she did it so quietly, so efficiently, that nobody thought to object until the bread was already rising. By supper, the brothers, who had survived for 2 years on beans, bacon, and whatever game they could shoot, sat in stunned silence in front of actual biscuits, actual stew with real vegetables in it. A pie that Lucy had somehow assembled from a wild berry patch Toby showed her behind the smokehouse that very afternoon. Wade watched Augusta move around his kitchen like she'd always belonged there, and felt something twist behind his ribs that he refused to name. Because she was competent, undeniably. That much he couldn't argue with. But her competence was also a quiet, constant reminder of the impossible situation sitting at his table. Every dish she set down was another silent negotiation. Every meal a question nobody had answered yet: stay or go. That first evening set the pattern for the days that followed. After supper, the 8 of them would gather in the main room, the fire snapping, the air thick with things nobody wanted to say out loud. Emmett retreated to his corner with a book most nights, though his eyes kept drifting toward Bea, who sat near the hearth with her sketchbook open on her lap, drawing with a focus that seemed to shut out the rest of the room entirely. One evening he worked up the nerve to look over her shoulder. He'd expected portraits, faces. What he found instead were quilt patterns, intricate, layered designs, geometric shapes folding into each other with a precision that made his breath catch. That's remarkable, he said. Quiet, barely above the crackle of the fire. Bea startled, color rising in her cheeks. It's foolishness, a way to pass the time. It's not foolishness, he said it like a correction, like a fact. It's art. She looked up at him, then, and something passed between them, small, fragile, real. A shared understanding that there was a world beyond dirt and chores and survival, and that it was worth reaching for even out here, even now. Across the room, Silas and Connie were locked in a different kind of exchange entirely. Sharp words, sharper glances. A woman's touch certainly improves a place, Silas said one morning, gesturing at the swept floor, the wiped table, like he expected gratitude. I imagine a man's effort in the barn would improve it more. Connie shot back, not even looking up from the dough she was kneading with more force than strictly necessary. Silas grinned, because for the first time in longer than he could remember, a woman wasn't falling over herself to laugh at his jokes, and something about that refusal lit a fire in him he didn't fully understand yet. He started leaving things. A wildflower on the porch rail, the best cut of jerky from his hunt. She ignored every offering pointedly, publicly, except Silas noticed the faint color that rose in her cheeks each time, and he noticed she never actually threw the flowers away. Toby and Lucy needed no such maneuvering. Their connection came easy, unburdened by whatever weight sat on their older siblings' shoulders. They fell into chores together like they'd been doing it their whole lives. Toby teaching her how to milk a cow without losing a tooth to a well-placed kick. Lucy teaching him constellations from a worn book she'd carried 2,000 miles because she couldn't bear to leave it behind. Her laughter, bright, unguarded, started echoing across the yard. In the evenings, it was the ranch hadn't heard longer than any of the Colton brothers wanted to admit. But the real current running under all of it, the one that mattered most, moved between Wade and Augusta. Two people built the same way, whether they wanted to admit it or not. Both of them carrying the weight of a family on shoulders that had stopped asking whether they were tired a long time ago. Their conversation stayed brief, practical, charged with something underneath that neither one named. "We'll need more flour from Henderson's before the week's out," she'd say. "I'll see to it," he'd answer, tone clipped. "The roof over the pantry's leaking." "I'm aware." Short, efficient, and underneath every exchange, something simmering that had nothing to do with flour or roofing. The following Sunday, the whole household rode into town together for the first time, and Silver Fork got its first real look at what had settled onto the Colton ranch. It did not go entirely kindly. Outside the mercantile, two women Wade recognized from church watched the sisters cross the street with an expression he'd seen, turned on stray dogs in unwelcome weather. He heard one of them murmur something to the other. Low, not quite low enough. Something about big appetites and desperate men, and he felt his jaw go tight before he'd even decided to be angry. Connie heard it too, everyone did. She didn't slow her stride, didn't so much as glance their way. "Small towns," she said mostly to Lucy, though pitched loud enough to carry, "do love finding something to chew on besides their own supper." Lucy laughed, bright and unbothered, and looped her arm through her sister's, and the two of them walked on into the mercantile, like the whispers were weather they'd simply decided not to dress for. Bea's chin had dropped, just slightly, her shoulders curling inward the way they did when the world got too loud for her liking. It was Emmett who fell into step beside her without a word, matching her pace, not saying a thing, just present, until her shoulders came back up on their own. Augusta hung back a moment longer than the others. Wade caught her watching the two gossiping women with an expression that wasn't hurt, exactly. Older than that. Tired in the specific way of a woman who has had this exact conversation happen around her, in one town or another, for most of her adult life, and has simply run out of energy to be wounded fresh by it every time. "They'll get used to us," she said, when she noticed Wade watching. "Or they won't. Either way, we'll still be standing here, come winter." "You don't have to prove anything to this town," Wade said. "I stopped trying to prove things to towns a long time ago, Mr. Colton." A small, dry note crept into her voice. "I only ever needed to prove it to myself. That's harder one. And it doesn't wear off the moment somebody whispers behind a glove." He didn't have an answer for that. He walked beside her, the rest of the way down the street instead, close enough that anyone watching would understand exactly where he stood on the matter, and if that started its own round of talk in Silver Fork, he found, to his own mild surprise, that he didn't much care. One night, after the others had gone to bed, Wade found her alone by the dying fire, staring into the coals like they held an answer she badly needed. The composure was gone, just for a moment, and what was underneath it stopped him in the doorway. Exhaustion, bone deep and old, the kind that doesn't come from one hard week but from years of never quite putting the weight down. "You can't," he said. Quiet, not cruel, just true. "You have to see that." Isis looked up. Her guster was wet, though she hadn't let a single tear fall yet, and she seemed determined not to. "Where would we go, Mr. Colton?" Her voice cracked on his name, and she hated it. He could tell, hated that it had cracked at all. "We spent everything we had left on those tickets. There's nowhere behind us. There's only this. That's not my burden to carry. I know that. She said it fast, like she'd been waiting for him to say it first, so she could agree before it wounded her too badly. I'm asking you to carry it anyway, just for a while. Wade said nothing. Let us prove it. She pressed on, and something in her tone had shifted from defense to something closer to plea, though she was clearly fighting to keep it from sounding like one. We are not afraid of work, Mr. Colton. Look at what 4 days has already done to this house. Give us 1 month if at the end of it you still believe where a burden will go. Wherever that means. I give you my word. Wade looked at this woman, carrying herself with a kind of ragged dignity that he recognized because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. Hands already going raw from lye soap and unfamiliar chores. Eyes that hadn't slept properly in longer than she'd probably admit. He saw his own reflection in her, and it unsettled him more than he wanted to say. 1 month, he said finally. His voice came out rougher than he intended. You have 1 month to prove this isn't a fool's arrangement. He turned to leave before she could see whatever was fighting for control of his face. Except as he walked toward his room that night, he heard it. Soft, from behind the closed door the sisters shared. Not crying. Sing. Bia's voice, low and sweet, humming some old lullaby to calm the others down after a hard, uncertain day. And Wade stood there in the hallway of his own house, listening to tan sound he's had holes on these walls since his mother passed, and felt something crack open inside him that he had no earthly idea how to close back up. The days that followed took on a fragile rhythm. Not peace exactly. More like a truce that both sides were still deciding whether to trust. Augusta kept her word. All 4 sisters did. They rose before the sun and worked past dark, their industry shaming even Silas into a kind of diligence nobody had seen from him before. The house gleamed. The garden long, neglected. More weeds than vegetables began, under Bea and Lucy's care, to show the first green shoots of something that might actually feed them come summer. Connie, to everyone's shock, turned out to have an uncanny way with the ranch's most stubborn animals. The same sharp tongue that kept Silas at arm's length worked wonders on a mule that had thrown every hand who'd tried to break it. Slowly, carefully, the tension between the 2 households began to loosen its grip. Laughter turned from a rarity into something almost ordinary. Shared glances across the supper table stopped feeling like accidents. Except Wade noticed something the others didn't, a shadow that crossed Augusta's face sometimes, when she thought no one was watching. Away she'd go still at the sound of a horse on the road, just for a second, before she caught herself and smoothed it away, because the story she'd told him that they'd come west, simply to stay together, simply for a fresh start, was true. It just wasn't the whole truth, and whatever the rest of it was, Wade could feel it sitting there under the surface of every conversation they had, waiting. One evening, nearly 3 weeks into their trial month, he caught her standing at the edge of the yard, watching the road that led toward town like she expected something to come down it that she badly didn't want to see. Augusta, she turned fast, too fast, like he'd startled something loose in her. It's she said. Too quick. You've said that before because it's usually true. Is it true now? She didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the tall grass at the edge of the property, and somewhere behind them Lucy's laughter carried across the yard, bright and unaware. There are things, Augusta said finally, carefully, like each word had to be tested before she'd let it out, that I haven't told you. Not because I don't trust you, because I'm afraid of what happens once you know them. Wade felt something go cold and steady in his chest, the way a man goes still and quiet whenever a storm is building on the horizon, and there's nothing left to do but watch it come. Try me, he said. Augusta looked at him for a long moment, deciding something. Not tonight, she said finally. I need a little more time before I hand you something I can't take back. And though every practical bone in Wade's body wanted to press her right then, wanted an answer before he let one more day pass, not knowing what kind of trouble he'd invited onto his land, something in her face stopped him. Because whatever she was carrying, it was heavy enough that she'd walk 2,000 miles, rather than put it down. All right, he said quietly. Take your time. He didn't know, standing there in the fading light, with the mountains going purple behind her, that time was the one thing they were about to run out of. Somewhere back east, a man neither of them had spoken of yet was already reading a letter, already circling a name on a map, already coming. But that night, on the porch of the Colton ranch, None of that had arrived yet. There was only the sound of the wind, and Lucy's laughter fading into the dusk, and Wade Colton standing a few feet from a woman he was starting, against every ounce of good sense he owned, to fall for. 1 month, he'd told her. He had no idea yet how much would happen before that month ran out. 3 weeks into the trial month, and the Colton ranch had started to feel like something worth keeping, because the garden had rows now. Real ones. Because the bread didn't come out burnt on the bottom anymore. Because Toby had started whistling while he worked, which he hadn't done since before their mother passed, and Wade noticed it every single time and said nothing, because saying something might scare it off. So maybe it was working. Maybe 8 people under one leaking roof wasn't the disaster he'd braced for, except peace on a ranch like this never lasted long enough to trust it. Wade had learned that the hard way, more than once. And the morning the letter came, he understood, moved in the pit of his stomach before his mind caught up, that the truce was already over. Emmett rode back from town with the mail pouch slung over his shoulder same as every week, except this time there was a letter that wasn't addressed to any Colton at all. It was addressed to Mrs. Marsh. There was no Mrs. Marsh, not one that had ever set foot on this ranch, which meant somebody back east didn't know that yet, or didn't care, or was using the name as a kind of code nobody outside the family was meant to understand. Augusta took it from Emmett's hand in the yard, and Wade watched her go still the way a rabbit goes still. Not calm. Frozen. Like something had heard a hawk overhead and was praying it hadn't been seen yet. "Who's it from?" Wade asked. "I don't know yet, Augusta." I said I don't know. She was already walking. Fast for a woman who never rushed anything. Straight past the porch and into the small room the sisters shared, and the door shut behind her, hard enough to rattle the frame. Wade stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and a feeling in his gut like the floor had shifted 6 inches to the left without warning him first. Inside, the 4 sisters gathered around the single narrow bed like it was an altar. Augusta broke the seal with hands that weren't quite steady, no matter how hard she tried to make them behave. "Read it," Connie said. Sharp, bracing herself the way she braced for everything, chin up, shoulders squared, ready to hit whatever came before it hit her first. Augusta read, "My dearest girls, I pray this finds you well and settled somewhere safe. I must be brief, because I fear even this letter is a risk. Inquiries have been made. A man came asking after your family 2 weeks past, well-dressed, careful with his questions. He did not give his name to anyone in the neighborhood, but the boy who runs errands for the milliner overheard him mention a name to his companion, Voss. He asked about your father's business dealings. He asked, most particularly, about where the family might have gone. Please, whatever you do, be careful. Burn this letter the moment you've read it. Yours in friendship and fear for you, Margaret Eldridge." The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Lucy made a small sound, half gasp, half sob, and pressed her hand over her own mouth like she could push it back in. "He found us," she whispered. "How did he find us?" "He hasn't found us," Augusta said. "Too fast, too firm, the kind of certain manufacturers, because the alternative is unbearable. He found where we've been. That isn't the same thing, isn't it?" Connie's voice had an edge on it now, sharper than usual, sharp enough to draw blood. "Because it sounds like the same thing to me, Augie." "It isn't. How do you know?" "Because if he knew where we were," Augusta said, and her voice cracked right down the middle on the last word, "he'd already be here." Nobody had an answer to that. Because it was true, and true things have a way of sitting in a room and refusing to leave. Bea hadn't said anything at all. She sat very still on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Bea only went quiet like that when the fear ran too deep for words to hold it. Augusta folded the letter along its old creases, looked at it a long moment, didn't burn it. She tucked it instead into the lining of her trunk, in a spot she'd sewn shut herself years ago, a hiding place built for exactly this kind of thing. Because some part of her, the part that had learned early and hard, never to trust that danger was truly gone, knew she might need proof of this someday. Proof for who, she didn't let herself think about yet. She didn't tell Wade that night, or the next. Because how did a woman explain a name like that to a man who had already given her family shelter based on half a story? Because every day she didn't say it felt like a small, cowardly mercy she was giving herself, and every day it also felt like a debt quietly accruing interest. Wade noticed the change in her anyway. He wasn't a man who missed much, not when it came to things that mattered on his own land. She flinched at hoofbeats on the road now, small but real. She stood at the kitchen window some evenings longer than the dishes required, watching the horizon like she expected something out there to be watching back. He didn't press. Not yet. Some instinct told him that pressing a woman like Augusta Marsh only made her dig in deeper, the way a spooked horse only runs faster when you chase it. So instead he watched and waited. And, in the meantime, life on the ranch kept moving forward with a stubbornness of its own, because that's what life does. Danger or no danger, letters or no letters. Silas had taken to finding excuses to be wherever Connie was working. He was not subtle about it. He was never subtle about anything. "You're following me," she said, one afternoon, not looking up from the mule she was currying, with more patience than the animal had any right to receive. "I live here, you live in the house. This is the barn. Barns are part of living here. You've never mucked a stall in your life. Silas Colton." "I could start. You won't. I might." She finally looked at him. Something in her expression almost softened into amusement before she caught it and hauled it back into place. "Why do you do that?" she asked. "Do what?" "Talk to me like I'm going to laugh eventually." Silas leaned against the stall door, arms crossed, that easy grin doing most of the talking for him. "Because you are. Eventually. You are the opposite of patient. You're the most impatient man I've ever met. For most things. Not for this." And there it was again, that flicker behind Connie's eyes, quick as a struck match, gone before it could catch. She turned back to the mule before he could see it fully. "Go be impatient somewhere else," she said, but there was no heat left in it. Not really. Silas didn't move for a long moment, just watched her work, aware of something settling into him that felt different from the usual restlessness. Dear, which frightened him a little, though he'd never have admitted that to a living soul. Because he'd spent 25 years running from anything that asked him to stay put, and here he was, staying. Emmett and Bea had found their own quiet rhythm, mostly built out of shared silences and small offerings. He'd started leaving books on the porch rail, where she'd find them. She'd started leaving sketches tucked inside the pages, small drawings of the ranch, the mountains, just once, and it caught him so off guard he had to sit down a small, careful drawing of his own hands, turning the pages of a book. He didn't say anything about it, didn't trust himself to. But he carried that page folded inside his coat for a week before he worked up the nerve to say, one evening by the fire, low enough that only she could hear it, "You see people the way most folks only see landscapes." Bea's needle paused over her stitching. "I mean, you notice things. The small true thing under the surface of a person." He hesitated. "Most people never bother looking that closely at anything. Let alone someone like me. There's nothing plain about you to look past, Emmett." It was the boldest thing she'd said to him yet, and the moment it left her mouth, she went red to the roots of her hair and bent back over her sewing like the fabric had suddenly become the most fascinating object in the territory. Emmett smiled at his book. Didn't read another word of it the rest of the night. Toby and Lucy needed no such careful choreography. Theirs was the easiest thing on the whole ranch, uncomplicated by fear or pride or old wounds, and watching them sometimes was the only thing that eased the tightness that had settled into Wade's shoulders those days. They worked the garden together most evenings, and Lucy had taken to naming the rows like they were people. "This one's stubborn," she'd say, pointing at a row of carrots that refused to sprout evenly. "This one's showing off about the beans climbing higher than anything had a right to." "You talk to vegetables," Toby said one evening, more delighted than teasing. "Everything grows better when somebody talks to it kindly," Lucy said, like it was the most obvious fact in the world. "People too." Toby considered with the seriousness of a much older man. "Nobody's ever talked to me all that kindly. Before you, I mean." Lucy looked up at him. Something soft crossed her face, something that had nothing to do with performance or flirtation. Just plain and true. "Well, I intend to keep doing it. If that suits you." "It suits me," Toby said, and meant it with his whole chest. The stranger rode into Silver Fork on a Tuesday, though nobody at the ranch knew it yet. He came in a hired buckboard, not on horseback, which told anyone paying attention that he wasn't used to the country and didn't intend to pretend otherwise. He wore a suit tailored somewhere that had never heard of Montana dust, and somehow the dust seemed to know better than to settle on it. He was a handsome man in his middle years, silver threading through dark hair at the temples, with the kind of smile that photographed well and meant nothing at all. He took a room at the only hotel in town, ordered a bath, asked the desk clerk, with a warmth that felt almost sincere, whether the clerk happened to know a family by the name of Colton. The clerk did. Everyone in Silver Fork did. By the time the sun set that first day, Jonas Voss had already learned more about the Colton Ranch, its debts, its acreage, its 4 unmarried brothers who'd recently taken in 4 sisters, under circumstances the whole town was still gossiping about, than most of the townsfolk had bothered to learn in years of living beside it. He didn't ride out to the ranch. Not yet. He went to the bank first. The First Territorial Bank of Silver Fork was a narrow brick building that looked out of place among the wood-frame storefronts, like it had wandered in from a bigger city and gotten stuck. Voss walked in like he owned the place already, which, within the hour, he very nearly did. The bank president was a nervous man named Callahan, who had spent 30 years lending money to ranchers who paid it late and grudgingly. He had never in his career met a man who wanted to buy a struggling rancher's debt out cash, with no negotiation at all. The Colton note, Voss said, settling into the chair across from Callahan's desk, like he was settling into a throne. I understand it's overdue on the spring installment. By some weeks, yes, but they never defaulted outright. I'd like to purchase it. Callahan blinked. Purchase the note itself? In full. Today, if it can be arranged. May I ask your interest in the matter, Mr. Voss? He offered nothing else. His smile didn't waver. Call it philanthropy, Mr. Callahan. I have a personal concern for a family currently residing on that property. I'd like to ensure they're looked after properly. It was, on its surface, an act of generosity so unusual that Callahan spent the better part of an hour trying to find the catch in it, and couldn't. Because the catch wasn't in the paperwork. The catch was in what that paper meant, once it changed hands. By supper time, Jonas Voss held the mortgage on the Colton Ranch, which meant, in practical terms, that he now held the single loudest voice in whether that family kept their land at all. He left the bank and walked, unhurried, to Henderson's general store, where he paid off the Colton's outstanding account in full without being asked, a gesture that looked like kindness to anyone watching and felt, to anyone who understood power, like exactly what it was. A leash, being fitted, one link at a time. He was patient about the rest. Over the following days, he took his meals at the hotel dining room, where half the town could overhear him, and he spoke, always gently, always with a convincing sorrow, about the 4 Marsh sisters and the tragedy that had befallen their family. Fine women, he told anyone who'd listen. Raised for better than a rough cattle spread. It's a hard thing, watching desperate men take advantage of women with nowhere else to turn. He never once said an unkind word about their size, their manner, their worth. He didn't need to. He simply planted the idea that they were vulnerable, easily led, in need of rescue, and let the town's own quieter prejudices fill in the rest. The same prejudices Wade had already watched flicker across 2 women's faces outside the Mercantile weeks before. Word reached the ranch 2 days later, carried by a shaken Henderson himself, who rode out specifically to deliver it because he didn't trust it to survive the trip through anyone else's mouth. Man came through town, Henderson said, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Bought your note clean off, Callahan. Paid your account here too. Says he's some kind of guardian to the Marsh girls. Says he's here to see they're properly cared for. Augusta's face had gone the color of old ash. What's his name? She asked, though some terrible part of her already knew the answer before Henderson said it. Voss, Henderson said, Jonas Voss. The name hit the yard like a gunshot. Lucy grabbed Bea's arm. Connie went rigid, jaw locked, eyes blazing with something that looked like fury and was, underneath it, pure terror. Augusta didn't move at all. She just stood there, absolutely still, while every color drained out of her expression one shade at a time. Wade watched all of it, and understood in that moment that whatever this was, whatever her family had been running from, had just ridden into his town wearing a good suit and buying up his debts, like they were nothing more than a curiosity to collect. Augusta, he said, low, steady, trying to be the ground under her feet when the ground had clearly just given way. Who is he? She looked at him, and for the first time since the stage had rolled into town, all the careful composure cracked straight down the middle and didn't put itself back together. He's the man who destroyed my father, she said, and he's the reason we ran 2,000 miles to get away from him. That night, after the others had gone to their rooms with fear sitting in the house like a fifth uninvited guest, Wade found Augusta on the porch. Same as before, except this time he didn't wait for her to speak first. "I need the whole truth," he said. "Not pieces of it. Not the parts you think I can carry. All of it." Augusta's hands were wrapped tight around a shawl she didn't need in the mild evening air. "More armor than warmth. You'll want to send us away once you hear it. Try me." She was quiet a long moment. The kind of quiet a person sits inside when they're deciding whether the relief of finally saying a thing out loud is worth the risk of what happens after. "My father, she began, and her voice was already unsteady, was an inventor. A good one. He held patents on mining equipment that made hard rock extraction faster, safer. After the war, he needed capital to build what he'd designed. He found a partner. Voss. Jonas Voss." She said the name like it cost her something. "Charming, well-connected. He funded my father's operation in exchange for half the profits. For 2 years it worked. We had money. We had a good house in Boston. My mother had never been happier. What happened? The mine my father was developing struck something bigger than equipment patents. A vein. Gold, real gold, in enough quantity to make a man wealthy for 3 lifetimes. And the moment Voss understood what he was sitting on, she stopped, steadied herself. He needed my father gone. Not dead. Worse in some ways. He forged documents showing my father had stolen the very patents he'd invented. Sold trade secrets to a rival company. It was airtight. My father went to prison protesting his innocence to a courtroom that had already decided he was guilty before he opened his mouth. Wade's jaw had gone tight enough to ache, and the mine, Voss kept it. Every claim, every deed, all of it, clean and legal on paper, because my father's name was too disgraced by then for anyone to question how convenient the timing was. Your father died in prison. Her voice broke clean in half on the word died, and she pressed her lips together hard, fighting to hold the rest of herself together by sheer will. 2 years into a 10-year sentence. Officially, his heart simply stopped. Nobody investigated further. Nobody cared to. A disgraced man dying quietly in a cell wasn't news. Wade said nothing for a long moment because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound small against what she just handed him. "And Voss," he said finally, "why come after you now? Years later, you're no threat to a man who already won." Augusta was quiet. Too quiet, which told Wade there was still one more layer under everything she'd already said. "There's a map," she said finally. "My father kept detailed records of everything, always, meticulous to a fault. Before he was arrested, he sent duplicate journals to his solicitor for safekeeping, along with something else. A second claim, staked but never filed, on a richer vein he'd found nearby and hadn't yet told Voss about. If that claim exists, if it can be proven it was staked in my father's name before Voss's forgeries, it unravels everything. His fortune, his reputation, all of it. You have this map. I don't know." Her voice cracked again, smaller this time, almost a whisper. "My mother believed she did. She spent years, before she died, hiding something, encoding something. I always thought it was grief. I never understood until recently that it might have been exactly what Voss is looking for." Wade sat with that a long moment, the full shape of it settling over him like a physical weight. "So he's not just looking for you," he said slowly. "He's looking for whatever your mother hid, and he'll tear apart everything in his path to find it." Augusta looked up at him then, eyes glassy in the moonlight, and the fear in them wasn't for herself. He could see that plainly. "Wade, I need you to understand what you've taken on. This isn't a domestic complication you can wait out. This is a man with more money than the entire territory, and he does not stop. Ever. Not until he owns everything he's decided belongs to him." Wade looked out at the dark shape of his land, the mountains black against a sky full of more stars than a man could ever hope to count. "There's something else," he said slowly. "Something I need to tell you, and I don't fully understand its myself." Augusta went still. "What?" "My father," Wade said. "Before he settled this land, he served in the war. Volunteer regiment out of Ohio." He paused, some old instinct crawling up the back of his neck. "He used to talk, sometimes, late at night, about a man he served alongside. A man who disappeared partway through, under circumstances nobody in the family ever got a straight answer about. He never said the man's name in front of us boys, just called him the one who ran." Augusta's breath had gone shallow. "You think?" She started and couldn't finish it. "I don't know what I think," Wade said. "But I think it's a strange thing. That a man who destroyed your father might also be a man my own father spent 30 years refusing to talk about. The silence between them stretched long and cold, full of a dread neither of them had words sharp enough to name yet. Because if it was true, if the threads reached back that far, tangled together since before either of them was born, then this was never simply an accident of a misprinted advertisement. Something or someone had been pulling these two families toward each other for a very long time. Voss rode out to the ranch. 3 days later, he came alone, which surprised no one who understood how men like him operated. He didn't need muscle behind him. He had paper instead, and paper, in the right hands, cut deeper than any blade. He dismounted in the yard with the easy confidence of a man walking onto property he already considered his. "Augusta, my dear," he said, a smile that didn't reach his eyes settling easily into place. "It's been too long. We are not your dear anything, Mr. Voss. I am your family's oldest friend. You are the man who put my father in his grave." Voss's smile flickered just once before he smoothed back into place. "A tragedy I've mourned every day since, which is precisely why I've come. To see you and your sisters properly cared for at long last. You've clearly been through a great deal, taken in by men who've shown us more decency in 3 weeks, Augusta cut in, than you managed in 3 years. Wade stepped up beside her. Silas, Emmett, and Toby fell into place behind them without needing to be told, a wall of brothers standing solid in front of the porch. "You've got business here, Voss." Wade's voice was flat. "Dangerous in its evenness. I hold the note on this land, Mr. Colton. That makes this very much my business. You hold paper. That's not the same as holding this ranch." Voss's gaze swept over the assembled group. Brothers and sisters standing shoulder to shoulder, and something calculating moved behind his eyes. "How touching," he said softly. "A little frontier family, all cobbled together out of a printing error and a rancher's charity." He looked back at Augusta. "Does he know? I wonder exactly what kind of trouble he's invited onto his land. Does he know what your mother spent her last years hiding, and what I intend to find one way or another?" "Get off my property," Wade said. Voss smiled, unbothered, already turning back toward his horse. "For now," he said. "But do think carefully, Mr. Colton, about the cost of standing between me and something I've spent 20 years waiting for." He rode off unhurried like a man with all the time in the world, which everyone standing in that yard understood with a sick, sinking certainty he very much believed he did. The weeks that followed turned the ranch into a kind of quiet siege. Voss didn't attack outright. That wasn't his method. He worked the way water works on stone, patient, relentless, wearing down the edges instead of striking the center. He spoke to the townsfolk, painting himself as a grieving guardian, and the Coltons as opportunists who'd lured 4 vulnerable women into a hasty, suspicious arrangement. Some of the town believed him. Enough of it, anyway, that the friendly nods Wade used to get outside the mercantile turned into sideways glances and hushed conversations that stopped the moment he walked close enough to hear them. The sisters felt it too, sharper and closer than Wade did. Lucy came back from an errand in town one afternoon, with her eyes red-rimmed, though she wouldn't say why until Toby pressed gently, and even then she only admitted that somebody at the dry goods counter had called the 4 of them a burden dressed up as a blessing, loud enough to be sure she'd hear it. Connie's answer to that kind of talk was to work twice as hard and say half as much, until even the ranch hands who came through for seasonal work started giving her a wide, respectful berth. Bea's answer was quieter. She simply stopped going into town at all for a stretch, staying close to the house in her sketchbook until Emmett noticed and gently, without making a single thing of it, started inviting himself along on her errands so she wouldn't have to walk those particular streets alone. Augusta said nothing about any of it, but Wade noticed she'd started standing a little taller on the days the whispers were worst, chin up, exactly the way her sister Connie did, like the whole family had learned the same defense from the same hard years and simply reached for it now without having to think. One evening, with the strain of it all pressing down on the house like a low ceiling, Augusta gathered everyone at the kitchen table after supper and said the thing she'd clearly been turning over for days. "We should leave." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Connie set down her cup hard enough to rattle the saucer. "Leave," she repeated, "and go where exactly, I don't know yet. But we've brought this down on the Coltons' heads, and it isn't slowing, and I won't sit at this table and watch a man like Voss ruin a family that had nothing to do with any of it, simply because we needed somewhere to land. You didn't bring anything down on us, Wade said flat. Final, in the way his voice went when he'd already made up his mind about something. Voss brought himself here. That's on him. Not on you and not on your sisters. He bought your mortgage, Wade. And I intend to buy it back the moment I've got the means, which I will, one way or another. That's a problem with a solution. You leaving isn't a solution. It's just a different shape of losing. Augusta opened her mouth to argue further, and Toby, of all people, cut her off, gentle but immovable. You said something once, he told her, about wanting one chance to stay together. That's not a thing you get to give up on my account, or Wade's, or anybody's. We're not scared of Voss. We're a lot more scared of you walking out that door because you think it's noble. It was, Wade thought, the most direct thing his youngest brother had ever said to a grown woman in his life, and it landed exactly the way it needed to. Augusta looked around the table at four brothers who had, without any of them quite noticing when it happened, stopped treating this as an arrangement and started treating it as a family. And something in her rigid posture finally gave, just slightly. All right, she said quietly. We stay. But we don't sit still and wait for him to finish what he started either. If he's going to fight dirty, we ought to at least understand what we're fighting. It was Silas who took that idea and ran furthest with it in his own particular fashion. He'd never once in his life needed an excuse to sit in a hotel bar and talk to strangers, and he saw no reason to start needing one now. He rode into town 2 evenings later and took a stool at the hotel's small dining counter, ordered a drink he didn't much want, and struck up an easy conversation with the desk clerk, a young man named Petey, who'd clearly been dying for somebody to talk to about the fine, mysterious gentleman occupying the best room in the house. Man gets more mail than the whole rest of the hotel combined, Petey said, polishing a glass with more attention than it required. Telegrams too. One came in 2 nights back that had him looking like he'd swallowed a hornet. Tore it right open in the lobby, which he never does. Usually takes his correspondence up to his room private. That's so, Silas said, keeping his voice easy, curious the way a man is curious about any stranger's business in a town this small. Any idea what it said? Couldn't say for certain, but I heard him mutter something to himself after. Something about the War Department. Didn't make a lick of sense to me, a mining man getting worked up over War Department business, but he wasn't a man you asked follow-up questions of, if you understand me. Silas turned that over on the ride home, slow and careful, the way he'd learned to turn over a hand of cards when the stakes were higher than they looked. War Department. A man who'd bought his way into this family's business with the manner of somebody who'd never once had to answer for anything in his life, going pale over a telegram that mentions the War Department. He told Wade about it that night, low, once the house had gone quiet. Doesn't prove anything, Wade said. But it's a thread. It's a thread, Silas agreed. Man like that doesn't flinch over nothing. Whatever's in his past, it's not just Augusta's father he's worried about somebody digging up. Neither of them said it plainly that night, but the shape of an idea had started forming between them that Voss's fear ran older and deeper than a single ruined mining partnership, and that, if the War Department frightened him, the War Department was exactly where a person ought to start looking. It was that thread, small and unremarkable as it seemed at the time, that would matter more than either of them yet understood. Then came the cattle, 12 head, gone from the north pasture overnight, and by the time Sheriff Otis Pruitt rode out to investigate, he arrived already convinced of what he'd find. Got a report, Pruitt said, in not quite meeting Wade's eyes, that some of your stock's been seen mixed in with a herd, sold 2 counties over. Bill of sales got your brand on the manifest. That's impossible, Wade said. We haven't sold a head all season. Well, somebody has. Paper says otherwise. Whose paper, Sheriff? Pruitt shifted his weight, uncomfortable, a man clearly standing somewhere he didn't want to be standing. Can't say. An anonymous tip. But I've got to follow it up, Wade. You understand? I understand somebody's paying you to make trouble on my land. That's a serious accusation. So is calling me a cattle thief on evidence you won't even show me. The confrontation ended without arrests, without proof, without anything solid enough to hold, but that was never the point. The point was the seed, planted in town, of a Colton ranch built on stolen ground and stolen stock, watered daily by a man with a fortune and nothing but time. It was Bia who found it, 3 nights after the sheriff's visit, with the whole house sitting heavy under the weight of everything closing in around them. She'd gone looking through her mother's old sewing basket for a particular shade of thread, something to finish a small mending job, bought that had nothing to do with anything important. It was, in fact, the most ordinary errand in the world, except her hand brushed something at the bottom of the basket that wasn't thread at all. A quilt. Unfinished. Dark blues and grays, somber colors for what should have been a celebration piece. And Bea remembered. She just looked at him. Her mother working on it in the last years before she died, always at night, always with her face set in an expression, but had been too young then to understand. She'd said once that she was sewing his truth into the fabric. Bea had never known what that meant. She pulled the quilt free now, spread it across the kitchen table under the lamplight, and called for her sisters with a voice that made everyone in the house come running. "Look," she said, her fingers trembling as she turned the backing over. "Look at the stitching along the border. It wasn't decoration. Not really. Beneath the surface pattern, worked in thread so close to the fabric's own color, it was nearly invisible, unless you knew to search for it, ran a line of tiny, deliberate stitches, letters, numbers, fragments that meant nothing at a glance, and everything once you understood you were looking at a code. It's not the map itself," Emmett said slowly, leaning in, his scholar's mind already working through the pattern like a puzzle. "It's a key, a reference. Whoever reads this needs to already know what it's pointing toward." "My father's journals," Augusta whispered. "The ones with his solicitor. This tells you where in them to look, what to search for." "Then we need those journals," Connie said, "which are in Boston, which is roughly 2,000 miles from where we're currently standing, in case anybody's forgotten." Silence settled over the table, because she wasn't wrong, and there was no clean answer waiting on the other side of that problem. Except Augusta had gone very still, staring at one particular cluster of stitched numbers near the quilt's corner, her face draining of color one more time that night. "Augusta?" Wade's voice, careful, watching her the way a man watches weather turning dangerous on the horizon. "This isn't a location for a claim," she said slowly, tracing the tiny stitches with one finger like they might vanish if she pressed too hard. "These are coordinates, landmarks. My mother didn't just hide the key to a fortune in here." She looked up, and what was in her face wasn't grief anymore. It was a horror freshly arrived, the kind that comes when a truth finally makes sense after years of not wanting it to. "She hid the place where my father actually died." The room went utterly silent. "I thought..." Lucy's voice came out small, childlike, disbelieving. "They told us his heart stopped. In his cell. That's what the letter said. That's what we were told." "I don't think that's true anymore," Augusta said. Her voice had gone hollow, stripped of everything but the terrible clarity of it. "I think these coordinates aren't a mining claim at all. I think my mother knew exactly where and how her husband really died, and she never told a living soul. Not us. Not anyone. She just sewed it into a quilt and prayed one of her daughters find it someday and understand what to do with it." Wade looked at the delicate, terrible stitches running along the edge of a quilt, meant to celebrate a marriage that had ended in tragedy instead. At Augusta, standing there with the full weight of a truth she'd carried without knowing its true shape for years. Somewhere out there, past the Bass Mountains, past 2,000 miles of prairie and river and hard-traveled road, lay proof, real proof, finally, after all this time, that Jonas Voss hadn't simply ruined a man's reputation and profited from his fall. He'd killed him, and buried the truth of it so deep that even his own victim's widow had spent her final years too afraid to speak it plainly, choosing instead to whisper it in thread, one careful stitch at a time, and trust that someday, someone brave enough would come looking. "He's not just after a fortune anymore," Wade said quietly, into the stunned silence of the room. "He's after making sure nobody ever proves what he did to get it." Augusta met his eyes across the table, and in them was something that hadn't been there before that night. Not just fear anymore, Wolf. "Then we don't let him," she said, "whatever it costs." Outside, the wind picked up against the windows, carrying the first cold breath of a storm, still gathering somewhere beyond the ridge. And every soul at that table understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the trial month Wade had offered a stranger on a dusty stage platform was no longer the biggest question hanging over the Colton ranch. The biggest question now was whether any of them would still be standing together by the time this was over. Emmett wrote the letter that same night by lamplight, while the rest of the house tried and failed to sleep. Because somebody had to do something besides wait for the storm to arrive. Because waiting had never once solved anything on this ranch. Not with weather and not with men like Voss. So while his brothers paced, and his sisters, to be sat, clutching a quilt, full of a dead man's secrets, Emmett at the desk in the front room and wrote to the one place he could think of that might still care about the truth more than about who was paying whom. The United States Marshals Service, Regional Office Helena. He wrote about the war record, about a man who'd vanished from an Ohio volunteer regiment under circumstances nobody had ever explained. He wrote about a mining claim, a forged fraud conviction, a prisoner who died conveniently quiet in his cell. He wrote it plain, and he wrote it careful, because a claim like this needed to land on a desk as fact, not as the desperate scrawling of a frightened family. He didn't tell Wade he'd sent it, not that night, because if it came to nothing, better to carry that disappointment alone. And if it came to something, well, better that be a surprise worth having. He rode into town before dawn to catch the eastbound mail before anyone else woke. Voss didn't wait for spring to finish making its case in his own favor. He came back to the ranch 8 days later, and this time he didn't come alone. Sheriff Otis Pruitt rode beside him, looking like a man who'd swallowed something bitter and was trying not to let it show on his face. Behind them both, at a careful, professional distance, rode a third man, narrow, watchful, dressed for travel rather than show. He hadn't been introduced to anyone at the ranch yet. He didn't offer to be. This was Franklin Cole, though the family wouldn't learn that name for another hour and wouldn't understand what it meant for another hour after that. The Colton family and the Marsh sisters gathered on the porch as the three riders came up the drive, 8 of them standing shoulder to shoulder, the way they'd learned to stand together over these past weeks without ever discussing that they were doing it. Voss dismounted first, unhurried, a man arriving to collect something he already considered paid for. "Augusta, my dear," his voice carried across the yard, warm as poison dressed up in silk. "I've come with the sheriff to see this matter settled properly once and for all." "There is nothing to settle," Augusta said. "You have no claim on us." On the contrary. Voss produced a folded document with a small flourish, the gesture of a man who had done this exact motion many times and enjoyed it every single time. "A court order from Boston, naming me legal guardian to the 4 Marsh sisters following your father's unfortunate conviction. Still very much valid. Sheriff," Voss added, turning to Pruitt, who was very carefully looking at a point somewhere over everyone's heads. "I'd like these women returned to my custody today." Pruitt cleared his throat. "Man's got papers, Wade. Papers signed 6 years ago, in a state 2,000 miles from here." Emmett cut in, stepping forward before Wade could answer. "For adult women currently residing in this territory of their own stated will." "I'd be curious, Sheriff, whether an out-of-state guardianship order carries force in Montana without review by a territorial judge. Seems like the sort of question worth asking before anybody's dragged off anybody's land." Pruitt shifted his weight, clearly wishing he were anywhere else in the territory. "That's a fair point, I suppose." Voss' smile thinned just slightly, the first real crack Wade had seen in it since the man arrived. "There's also," Voss said, recovering smoothly, producing a second document, "the small matter of this ranch's mortgage, which I now hold, which is, I'm afraid, in arrears. I could have this entire family evicted from this land by morning, Mr. Colton, whether or not the sheriff sees fit to enforce my guardianship today." It was everyone standing on that porch understood in the same sick heartbeat. A very neat trap. Legal on one side, financial on the other, and precious little ground left standingish between for any of them to hold on to. Wade felt something settle in him then, cold and clear and absolutely certain. "They're not going anywhere," he said, "because they're not your wards, Voss." Betrothed. Silence, pure, ringing silence, broken only by a horse shifting its weight somewhere behind them. Silas's mouth actually fell open. Toby made a small, strangled sound of pure shock. Connie's eyes went wide as saucers, and Augusta turned to stare at Wade like he'd just said something in a language she'd never learned. It was a lie. A desperate, sweeping, monumental lie, but it was also in that moment the only shield any of them had left. Voss laughed. An unpleasant, condescending sound that had no warmth anywhere inside it. "Betrothed," he repeated. "You expect anyone to believe that?" "Believe what you like," Wade said. "It's the truth. This is a business transaction, Colton. A rancher and a fortune he thinks might be hiding somewhere in these women's family history. Do not insult me by dressing it up as romance." "Careful," Wade said low. "You're describing your own methods, not ours." Something dangerous flickered behind Voss's eyes. But before he could answer, the third rider, the quiet one, the one nobody had introduced, finally spoke. Mr. Voss. Voss turned mildly irritated at the interruption. And you are? Deputy United States Marshal Franklin Cole. He said it plainly. No flourish, the kind of plain that carried more weight than any amount of theater ever could. I received a letter 8 days ago concerning a mining fraud case out of Boston, and a war record that doesn't quite match the story a man's been telling for the past 20 years. The yard went very, very still, because Wade hadn't sent that letter, which meant, but somewhere in this family, somebody else had, quietly, without telling a soul, and had just chosen the single most devastating moment possible for it to arrive. Emmett stood very straight, saying nothing, his heart hammering loud enough he was half certain everyone could hear it. Voss's composure did not break. Not yet. Men like him had spent lifetimes learning not to break in front of an audience. But something underneath it went taut, wire tight, the first true crack showing at the edges. I don't know what you're referring to, he said. I think you do. Cole dismounted, unhurried, and reached into his saddlebag for a slim folder, worn at the edges from travel. Took some doing. Ohio Volunteer Regiment records don't cross-reference easy with Boston mining licenses. But once I had a name to search under the real one, not Jonas Voss, the rest came together faster than you'd like. This is absurd. Private Jonas Ellery Whitfield, Cole said, reading it plain off the paper like a man reading a grocery list, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd shouted it. Deserted his post in the spring of 1865, 3 weeks before the surrender at Appomattox. Took the papers off a courier killed by artillery fire 2 days prior and used them to vanish clean out of his own regiment's rolls. He looked up. There was one man left in that company who knew. The courier hadn't deserted at all, because he was the one who buried him, a private who mustered out honorably at war's end and went home to Boston to build a life for himself. His name was Elias Marsh. Augusta made a sound like all the air had left her body at once, because they'd known Voss ruined her father's business. Known he'd stolen the mine. Known, since the quilt, that he'd likely killed him years later at the claim site. They had never once imagined the two men had known each other decades before any of that. That Voss had come looking for a mining partner named Elias Marsh, not by coincidence, but because Marsh was the one man alive who could have exposed him with a single letter to the War Department, and that keeping him close, keeping him grateful, keeping him quiet with money and friendship, had always been the safer path, right up until the mine made silence too expensive to maintain. That's a lie, Voss said. His voice had lost its silk. What was underneath it now was raw and ugly and afraid, a fabrication, cobbled together by desperate peasants trying to save their worthless land. Perhaps, Cole said, unbothered, except desertion during wartime is a federal matter, regardless of how many years have passed. Mr. Whitfield, and a man traveling under a false identity for 2 decades, defrauding business partners under that same false name. Well, that's the sort of thing my office takes a genuine interest in. You have no authority here. I have every authority here. Cole's voice hardened for the first time, steel finally showing through the plain delivery. I've been in contact with the Boston field office since your letter arrived, Mr. Emmett Colton. Formal investigations already underway into Elias Marsh's original fraud conviction. Given what we now know about the man who supplied the evidence against him, he looked at Voss directly. I imagine that conviction won't survive review much longer. Voss's face had gone the color of old ash. He looked around the yard at Wade, at Augusta, at 4 brothers and 4 sisters standing united against him, and understood, in the space of one long, terrible breath, that every advantage he'd spent 20 years building had just come apart at once. You may have bought a mortgage, sir, Wade said quietly, into the wreckage of the silence. But you can't buy the United States Marshal's service. Voss said nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. He wrenched his horse around and rode, not with the unhurried confidence he'd arrived with, but fast, low over the saddle, a man running from something for the first time, and longer than he'd probably admit even to himself. Marshal Cole watched him go with the flat, patient expression of a man who had chased worse men over longer distances and had never once lost. He won't get far, Cole said almost to himself. He turned back to the family, still standing, frozen on the porch. I'll need statements from all of you when you're ready. But I don't imagine you'll be losing this land, Mr. Colton, or these women their freedom. A pause. Something almost gentle crossing his weathered face. For what it's worth. 20 years is a long time to run from the truth. I'm glad it finally caught him, instead of the other way around. He tipped his hat, mounted, and rode after Voss at an unhurried pace that somehow felt more certain than any gallop could have. Sheriff Pruitt lingered a moment longer, turning his hat over in his hands, looking like a man working up the nerve to say something he badly didn't want to say. "Reckon I misjudged this whole situation," he said finally, mostly to his boots. "A man shows up with money and fine paper. It's easy to see past the shine and miss what he's really carrying underneath it." He looked up at Augusta, then let his gaze move, deliberately, to each of her sisters in turn. "My apologies, ladies. All four of you. Truly ought to have looked past my own nose a long while before this. Glad you're safe." He rode off toward town without waiting for a reply, and the yard fell into a silence that was, for the first time in weeks, not the silence of dread. It was the silence of people who had just survived something and hadn't yet found the words for what came next. The dam broke inside the house that evening, the way it always does once danger, finally, truly passes. Lucy cried first, a great heaving sob that was half grief for a father she barely remembered and half pure relief. And Toby had his arms around her before the sound had even finished leaving her throat. Connie stood ramrod straight by the window, chin lifted, refusing to let herself cry in front of anyone until Silas, without a word, simply put his hand over hers on the sill, and something in her finally gave way, silent tears tracking down a face that had spent 20 years determined never to show weakness to a living soul. Bea sat wrapped in a quilt that was not the coated one, her whole body shaking with something that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite laughing, until Emmett knelt down in front of her and simply held both her hands until the shaking stopped. And Augusta stood very still in the middle of the kitchen, the same kitchen she'd taken over on her very first night in this house, and closed her eyes, and let the whole enormous weight of the last several years finally leave her shoulders. Wade found her there. Didn't say anything at first, just stood close enough that she'd know he was there if she needed the ground to hold. "It's over," he said finally. "It's over," she repeated, like she was testing whether the words were true by saying them out loud herself. They were. But there was one piece of it that wasn't finished yet, and Augusta knew at the moment the first wave of relief had passed enough to let her think clearly again. 6 days after Voss's arrest, with the ranch settling into a hush none of them entirely trusted yet, Augusta found Wade mending fence along the north pasture and stood beside him a long moment before she said what she'd come to say. "I need to go to the place on the quilt." Wade set down his hammer. "You don't have to do that. Cole has enough now to see Voss tried for what he did. You don't need to see the place itself. I know I don't need to." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it he'd come to recognize by now, the particular resolve she wore when a thing frightened her, and she'd decided to do it anyway. "But my mother spent years hiding that location. She wanted one of us to find it, not just to condemn Voss with it. I think she wanted him brought home, Wade, properly, wherever home means for a man who died that far from it." Wade looked at her for a long moment, then picked his hammer back up, only to set it down again, decision made. "Then we go together," he said. "You, me, and Emmett, since he's the one who can read that quilt better than the rest of us combined. 2 days out if the coordinates hold up. Silas can mind the ranch." They rode out the following morning, the three of them, following a trail of numbers and landmarks stitched into fabric by a grieving woman who had never once expected her daughters to need them for anything but proof of a crime. And it took the better part of 2 days, climbing steadily northwest into country wilder than anything around Silver Fork, the kind of high, lonesome ground where a man's disappearance might never be questioned by anyone who didn't already know to look. They found it on the second afternoon. An old mining claim, long abandoned, the shaft entrance mostly collapsed, a rusted length of chain still looped around a stake driven into the rock nearby a claim marker. Emmett said, quietly, studying it, "Staked and never properly filed. Exactly the kind of second claim Augusta's father had described in his own hand in journals none of them had ever gotten to read. It was Augusta who found the rest, working carefully through the brush near the collapsed entrance, guided by the last cluster of numbers on the quilt. A small tin box, rusted nearly through, buried shallow enough that 20 years of Montana winters hadn't managed to erase it entirely. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, a pocket watch, stopped forever at 4:15. A wedding band too small for anyone's hand but a woman's, which Augusta understood the moment she saw it. Her father must have carried with him everywhere, even to a mine shaft in the middle of nowhere, even facing a man who'd already decided to kill him. And beneath both, folded many times over, a single page in handwriting Augusta recognized instantly, because she'd spent her whole childhood watching that same hand sketch valve diagrams late into the night. It was not a long letter. Her father had known, by the time he wrote it, that he likely wouldn't be leaving that mountain. He'd written only a handful of lines to his wife, to his daughters, saying he was sorry for the fortune he'd never lived to see them enjoy, and sorrier still for the years of fear he suspected his death would leave behind. He asked if the letter was ever found, that whoever found it not seek vengeance on his account. Only the truth. Only enough truth to let his girls stop running. Augusta read it once, aloud or breaking somewhere in the second line, and never quite recovering for the rest of it. Wade stood close enough to catch her if her knees gave out, though they didn't. Because whatever else Augusta Marsh was, she had never once in her life allowed herself the luxury of falling apart when there was still something left to finish. They buried the tin box's contents properly, there on the mountain, marking the spot with stones stacked the way ranch families marked graves too far from town for a proper headstone, and Emmett said a few quiet words over it, because Emmett always knew what needed saying, even when nobody else could find the words. "Rest easy, Elias Marsh," he said. "Your daughters made it further than you dared hope, and they never once stopped trying to bring you home." They rode back to Silver Fork 3 days later, and Emmett sent the letter itself, along with a careful account of everything they'd found, directly to Marshal Cole's office in Helena. It reached Boston within the month, entered as evidence in the reopened inquiry into Elias Marsh's conviction, and did more in a single page of a dying man's handwriting than 20 years of silence ever could have. The formal exoneration came through official channels. Some weeks later, a document with a judge's seal that Augusta read 3 times before she let herself believe it was real. Her father's name cleared. His patents restored to the family estate for whatever they were now worth after 2 decades of Voss's theft. It would not undo a childhood spent watching their mother sew grief into a quilt by candlelight. It would not give any of them back the years they'd spent running. But it gave Elias Marsh, at long last, the one thing his daughters had crossed 2,000 miles trying to protect. His good name, restored and no longer anyone's secret to keep. The house settled into a strange, tender quiet over the days that followed, because relief, it turns out, takes almost as much getting used to as fear does. And because Wade's declaration on the porch, their my betrothed hung over everything now, no longer a shield they needed, but a truth nobody had actually agreed to yet. The brothers gathered by the barn one evening, ostensibly checking on stock, actually just needing somewhere to stand together and let the last of the adrenaline drain out of their bones. "Betrothed," Silas said, leaning against a stall door with a grin that couldn't quite decide if it was teasing or genuinely impressed. "You don't do things by halves, do you, brother?" "It was needed," Wade said, gruff, though a flush was already creeping up the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the evening heat. "It felt right," Toby said, chest puffed out, with the pride of a youngest brother who'd just watched his oldest brother do something brave. "Didn't it? It felt right to all of us." Emmett, ever the thinker, watched the lamplit windows of the house with a considering look. "It was a public declaration, Wade, in front of a federal marshal, no less. Words like that carry weight in a territory this size." "I know that. You planning on making it true, then?" Wade didn't answer right away. He was looking toward the kitchen window, where he could just make out Augusta's silhouette moving against the lamp glow inside. "I don't intend to make a liar out of myself," he said finally, and turned and walked back toward the house, leaving his brothers to trade looks of pure astonishment behind him. He found her on the porch after supper, the sky above them, turning purple and gold together, the way it only seemed to manage out here, like it couldn't decide which color mattered more, and had settled on both. "I owe you an explanation," Wade said, "for what I said." In front of Voss, Augusta didn't look at him right away. She was watching the horizon, the place where the mountains met the last of the light. "It kept us safe," she said. "You don't owe me anything beyond that. That's not why I said it." That got her attention. She turned, slow, careful, like she was bracing for something and hoping, despite everything, that she was wrong to brace. "Then why?" Wade took a breath. It felt heavier than any breath he'd taken. Chasing cattle through a blizzard, heavier than anything she'd carried since his father died and left this whole ranch sitting on his shoulders alone. Because before you came, he said, this house was just a place I slept between one exhausting day and the next. This ranch was just work I did, because somebody had to. I told myself I didn't have room in my life for wanting things. That wanting things was a luxury a man with debts and dead parents and 3 younger brothers couldn't afford. He looked at her fully now. Then you stepped off that stage carrying the weight of the whole world, and you never once let it. I watched you protect your sisters like a fortress with legs. I watched you work until your hands bled to make this place a home it had never been, not once, not since my mother passed. You didn't just bring order to this house, Augusta. You brought it back to life. You brought me back to life, and I didn't even know I'd gone missing until you showed up. Augusta's eyes had gone bright, wet, unblinking. You once told me you needed 1 month, Wade said, quieter now, to prove this wasn't a fool's arrangement. That month came and went so long ago, I lost count somewhere in the 2nd week, because by then I already knew what I wanted the answer to be. I just didn't have the courage yet to say so out loud. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small, plain band, his mother's, the only piece of jewelry that had survived 2 hard winters and a decade of debts. Nobody had let him sell it to cover, because some part of him had always somehow been saving it. I am asking you now, he said. Not because Voss forced my hand, not because of paper or land or any of it. I'm asking because this is where I want to build the rest of my life, and I don't want to build it with anyone else standing beside me. Will you marry me, Augusta Marsh? For real. For good. Augusta stared at the ring like it might vanish if she looked away too soon. I came here, she whispered, looking for a place my sisters could be safe. I never once let myself hope I'd find. She stopped, pressed her lips together. I never let myself hope I'd find a home, or someone who'd see all of me and choose to stay anyway. I'm not just staying, Wade said quietly. I'm choosing every single day for as long as you'll let me. Yes, Augusta said, and the word came out on a sob and a laugh at the same time, the 2 feelings too tangled together to separate.
Yes.
1,000 times yes. He pulled her into his arms on that porch, under a Montana sky finally settling into full dark, and the last of whatever fear had lived in her chest for 20 years simply, quietly let go. Word of it spread through the house before either of them had even come back inside, the way news always does in a home with that many sharp-eared sisters and brothers under one roof, which meant, somehow, it lit a fuse under everyone else too. Silas found Connie by the corral the next evening, the last of the crisis, finally settling into something like peace behind them both. She had her arms crossed on the top rail, watching the sunset with an expression softer than he'd ever once seen on her. He's really gone, she said. For years I imagined what I'd say to Voss if I ever stood in front of him again. Pictured myself screaming. Instead, I just felt tired. You've been fighting a war your whole life, Silas said, coming to lean beside her. Tired's allowed. She glanced at him sideways. Is this your version of a proposal, Colton? Working up to it, he let out a short laugh, more nervous than he'd expected. I've known plenty of women, Connie. Charming ones. Easy ones. And then I met you, and you looked at me like I was something you'd scraped off your boot, and I have never once in my life wanted anything more than I wanted you to look at me different. Careful, she said. Compliments don't suit you. I'm serious. His usual glib ease entirely deserted him, and it made every word land harder for it. Your prickles aren't a flaw, Connie. They're armor around the softest, most loyal heart I've ever come across. I watched you stand up to a man who terrified grown federal marshals without blinking once. That fire in you, it doesn't scare me off. It's the only thing I've ever wanted to build a life around. He took her hand on the rail. I'm a gambler and a troublemaker, he said, but I'm willing to bet everything I have, for the rest of my life, on you. A single tear slid down her cheek before she could stop it, and she wiped it away fast, half annoyed at her own self for the betrayal of it. You'd be making a terrible bet, she whispered. It's the first sure thing I've ever seen in my whole reckless life. All right, gambler. A smile broke through at last, small and real and entirely hers. You've got a deal. Inside, Emmett found Bea at the kitchen table, the coated quilt spread out in front of her, though this time she wasn't tracing the hidden stitches with dread. She was simply looking at her mother's handwork, at the love and grief and courage sewn into every careful line. She would have loved this place, Bea said quietly as he sat beside her. The mountains, the wildflowers, I think she'd have made a quilt just for the sunset. She put everything she had left into protecting the truth about your father, Emmett said. That's not a small thing, Bea. That's the same strength I see in you, every single day. Bea looked up at him. My letter to the paper said I wanted someone who loved poetry. I understand now that wasn't quite right, no? I wasn't looking for someone who loved poetry, she said, soft, certain. I was looking for someone who was poetry, someone who notices the story hiding in the ordinary things, the hope folded into a garden, the grief sewn into a quilt border. She took a breath. I found him already. I just hadn't said so out loud. Emmett's hand found hers on the table, gentle, careful, the way he did everything. I want to spend my days watching you draw, he said, and my nights reading to you by this fire, for as long as either of us has left to give. Would you consider it a life here, with me? Bea's answer was not words at all. It was simply her arms around his neck, and a sob of pure happiness, catching somewhere between her heart and her throat, and Emmett holding her like he'd finally found the one true thing his careful, bookish mind had been searching for all along. Toby and Lucy's moment came, fittingly, in the garden they'd built together with their own hands, row by stubborn row. There were no grand speeches between them. There didn't need to be. Their whole connection had always been the simplest, truest thing on the ranch, plain as good soil and honest work. Before you got here, Toby said, looking at the neat green rows rising up around them in the evening light, this was just dirt. Now look at it. You did half of that yourself, Lucy said, smiling. You taught me how. He turned to face her fully, his voice cracking slightly around the edges of something he'd clearly been holding on to for weeks. My whole life I've watched my brothers and wanted to be like them. Brave like Wade, charming like Silas, smart like Emmett. But since you got here, all I've wanted is to be a man you could be proud of standing beside. He took a breath. I think I fell in love with you the moment you stepped off that stage, looking at this whole dusty, broken down town like it was the most wonderful place you'd ever seen. I don't want this to be an arrangement anymore, Lucy. I want it to be real. Forever kind of real. Will you marry me? Her answering yes came out as a bright, joyful cry that startled a flock of birds up off the fence line, and she threw her arms around his neck as he spun clean off her feet, both of them laughing in a way that was, without question, the purest sound the Colton Ranch had heard, in more years than any of them could count. 6 weeks later, the whole of Silver Fork turned out for a wedding, the likes of which the territory had never seen. 4 ceremonies, one right after another, held in the same golden afternoon light, under a sky so wide and blue it looked freshly painted just for the occasion. Bea wore a dress she'd sewn herself, quiet and lovely, with tiny stitches along the hem that only Emmett would ever know, spelled out the date they'd first spoken by the fire. Her figure soft and unhidden in a cut she'd chosen because it pleased her, not because it apologized for anything. Connie wore a fierce, unapologetic smile and a gown fitted to her own sturdy, capable frame, the kind of dress that dared anyone in that town to whisper a single unkind word, and not one soul did, because they'd all watched by then exactly what that fire was capable of protecting. Lucy laughed through nearly the entire ceremony, round-cheeked and glowing, too full of joy to hold it in, and Toby laughed right along with her, neither one of them minding in the least. And Augusta. Augusta stood at the front of that gathered crowd in a dress the color of Montana wildflowers, cut generous through the shoulders and the waist, because that was the shape she'd been given, and she'd long since stopped wishing for another one. Her sisters beside her, the family she'd fought 2,000 miles and 20 years of grief to protect, finally fully safe. She looked nothing like the fashion plates back east had ever told a bride she ought to look, and she had never once, standing there, your dues, felt more beautiful in her entire life, because somewhere along this hard, dusty, unlikely road, all 4 sisters had learned the truth their mother had tried to sew into a quilt for them to find. That worth was never something other people got to measure. That bodies built strong enough to carry a family across a continent, to work a ranch back to life, to stand unflinching in front of gossiping strangers and dangerous men alike, were not something to apologize for, not to a town, not to fashion, not to a man like Voss, who'd spent years trying to convince the world that women like them ought to be grateful for whatever scraps of regard they were offered, that the right kind of love didn't ask a woman to shrink herself down to fit into somebody else's narrow idea of what deserved to be cherished. It simply saw her, all of her, and then kept choosing her, every single day after. Wade took Augusta's hands in front of the whole gathered town, in front of his brothers, in front of her sisters, in front of the wide Montana sky that had watched this family come together out of nothing but a mistake and a mile of stubborn hope. "I told a lie once. On this land," he said, loud enough for the whole town to hear, his voice steady, despite the emotion thick underneath it. "Told a man you were my betrothed to keep you safe. I want the whole of Silver Fork to hear me say plainly now that was never really a lie at all. It just took me a little while to catch up to the truth of it." Augusta laughed through fresh tears, the sound of it carried away on the same warm wind that had first blown red dust across a stage platform months before, back when 4 strangers had arrived, expecting nothing more than an awkward new beginning. They'd found instead an entire family forged, not by a printing error, though that had been the door, forged by choice, by courage, by 8 people who had chosen, again and again, in the hardest moments, to stand shoulder to shoulder instead of walking away. The Colton Ranch, once just a monument to stubborn survival, became something else that day. A home, full and loud and finally, completely alive. And for generations after, the story of the 4 brothers and the 4 sisters who found each other by accident and chose each other on purpose would be told across that valley, not as a tale of desperate strangers making the best of a mistake, but as proof that sometimes the most unexpected arrivals lead a person exactly where they were always meant to be.